What is like the gold standard of universal school choice?
Tell them to pass education savings accounts. This is the gold standard of universal school choice. It's much like a health savings account where the funding that's meant to follow you to the government school, you can take in the form of an education savings account directed by the parent. You can use it to pay for private school tuition and fees, much like a voucher. But you can also use the funding for homeschool curriculum, special needs educational therapies, micro schools, what a lot of people were calling pandemic pods during the COVID era, 5 to 10 children getting together in a household, homeschool co ops. It's the purest form of the money following the child. But like an HSA for health savings account, you can't use the money on drugs or things that are not approved. It has to be approved education expenditures, and that's about as free market as you can get while making sure the funding is still meant for education, is being used on education. And in places like Arizona, I'd say this is the best way to do it. Arizona has all these anti-regulation stipulations explicitly in the statute that you are not a government actor if you're taking the money. You don't have to teach the public school curriculum or test. And so that's the way to do it. You want to be as light touch regulation as possible. They just have a random annual audit to make sure, again, you're not spending the money on nefarious activities, that it's being used on education activities. And I think that's pretty reasonable, even for your most hardcore libertarians, to make sure that taxpayer funding is being used on education and not other activities. So in Arizona, they do this. The government schools spend about $14,000 per kid per year. If you still want that opportunity, if you like your public school, you can keep your public school, but for real this time, and they do get better. But if not, $7,000, the state portion of the funding, follows you to a savings account directed by the parent. Again, can be used for any approved education expenditure. It can even roll over from year to year. Let's say you're going to a low-cost Catholic school for elementary school, and let's say it's only $5,000 a year. In Arizona, they have some that are that low. You can save the extra two. You can use it for tutoring or other expenses, but if you don't spend all of it in 1 year, you can save it for high school, which tends to have a higher tuition than an elementary school. And then in some cases, if you're done through K through 12 and you still have money left over, you could even use it for post-secondary education as well for 4 years. And it might not be a case in a lot of cases because this is half of the amount that what is spent in the public schools. And by the way, this saves taxpayer money at the same time. You're spending half the amount that you would have spent in the government-run school system per student, but you're also giving families more freedom to choose at the same time.
Um, the the claim, the criticism that gets made is that you've said it a couple times. Oh, you're taking away, you're defunding the local school. But I think that there is this claim that isn't entirely legitimate, which is to say, look, what you're going to have is it's not enough money to go to the best school. It's enough money to support, someone who already can afford, or at least is like at the margin can afford to send their kids to the private school. And so what's going to happen is that the public school that currently exists, that's doing a terrible job or doing not a good enough job to keep students because the parents are pulling their kids out, is just going to get worse because now the engaged parents are leaving and its funding is shrinking as it loses enrollment. And what about the kids whose parents don't have one extra nickel? They still have to send their kid to this school, or, it's physically close in proximity and the only other options are going to cost them in other ways, like having to figure out how to do private transportation to get them to the school, or, there's all kinds of other costs involved in making these choices besides just the tuition. And so you're setting up a system that's going to increase inequality of outcomes and make it more subject to wealth effects and entrenched sort of economic inequality. What's your answer to that criticism? I hope I did it
This,
justice, given that I think it's
yeah,
nonsense. But
inequality is built into the government-run school system today, and so having the funding follow the child even if it's only $7,000 to $10,000, that's still a step in the right direction towards expanding equality of opportunity. The most advantaged are the ones who have school choice today. They can afford to pay out of pocket for private school tuition and fees. They're the ones who are more likely to be able to afford to live in the best neighborhoods that are assigned to the best quote unquote public schools. And so giving more families opportunities expands opportunities for more families than who previously had them. And by the way, the people who are saying that, $7,000 isn't enough to cover tuition, there's a whole range of different tuition in private schools. The national average is about $10,000 to $12,000 per student. And in Arizona, the median tuition, I'm quoting 7,000 because I was talking about the Arizona Scholarship Program. That's the state portion of funding there. It's $7,000 per student per year. Their median tuition, according to a report by Goldwater Institute for private schools, is about $7,000. So that covers about half of the private schools in the state of Arizona. And so just because you can't access 100% of the schools, you were able to access 0% of them before. Now you can access 50%. That is a huge step in the right direction. We shouldn't make perfect the enemy of the good, and we should take any win we can when it comes to expanding opportunities. And when you look at families and just look at the data in other locations, in D.C., they've been doing this for a while. They've had their D.C. voucher program for a long time. The scholarship's only about $10,000 to $12,000 per student. Average public school spending per student in D.C. is about 3 times that amount. It's over $30,000 per kid in the government schools. So you have low-income families, average household income in D.C. using this program, about $30,000 per household per year. 95% of the kids are Black or Hispanic, and they're still flocking to this program. Thousands of kids use it each year. Thousands are on the wait list each year trying to get their kids better educational opportunities, and they're able to figure it out. They're able to either get private scholarships from the school itself, because you may have a sticker price of $15,000, but they may say for low-income kids, you only have to pay $8,000 to $10,000. It
Right.
depends on the school, but that is often the case as well. And so this has worked out in several locations in Florida. Before they went universal, they now have like 400,000 scholarships awarded this year in Florida. But before, in 2018, they had about 100,000 scholarships awarded. The data at the time showed about an average household income of about $35,000 to $40,000 per year. And so, it's not like super wealthy that are using it. But at the end of the day, no one should be forced to pay twice. We don't discriminate when it comes to access to government schools based on income. We kind of do based on zip code. But everybody can go to a government school regardless of your income. We shouldn't discriminate when it comes to access to school choice on the basis of income either. And so no family, whether you're high income, low income, you should be able to take your child's education dollars. Look, wealthy families are paying into the system. They might as well get the average amount back to be able to pay for private school tuition and fees as well if they'd like. But a lot of the same people who make this argument that this is not enough, they would never support an amendment to increase the scholarship amount. Hey, increase it to what's being spent into the government schools. They would vote against that every step of the way. And why would they do that? They would say, this is defunding the public school, which is what they always say. And at the end of the day, when it's only $7,000 or half following the student, the government schools financially benefit on a per student basis. They're keeping the local dollars. They're keeping the federal dollars. And so on a per student basis, they're actually better off than they were before. It's like, imagine if you stopped shopping at Walmart and you wanted to go to Trader Joe's or somewhere else, and Walmart got to keep half your grocery funding each week, even though you weren't shopping there. That would make 0 sense, but that's how politics works sometimes. Walmart would be happy with that deal. I would argue that this is a fantastic deal for the government schools, that they get to keep any money at all, thousands of dollars per student per year, for students they're no longer educating. So again, this is a win-win solution. It's a win for the kids who get a choice, but it's also a win for the kids who remain in the public schools, and it's a win for the school system that they get to keep any money at all. It should be 100% of the dollars follow the student. That's not how politics works sometimes. You got to create winners on each side of the aisle and to make a deal happen. And so it turns out to be a win-win solution. And the public schools get better. There are 29 studies on this subject nationwide. 26 of those 29 studies find positive effects. More school choice, better outcomes in the public schools.
The argument for government doing things, there's multiple arguments for the government doing things. And in the spectrum of politics, you can be on the far free market individualist side. You could say government should do nothing, or that government should just sort of protect the borders and keep us from being invaded. Or you could say, well, the government should mostly leave us alone, but maybe have a little like social insurance to keep people from falling through the cracks at the worst case scenario. Or you could go all the way to just like communism, like the government should plan 5-year society from the top down, and maybe they're elected and maybe it's democratic socialism, but it's democratic in this case is especially two wolves and a sheep deciding what to have for dinner. But that's the spectrum here. And among the arguments for when government should step in is, are things a natural monopoly? This is like sort of Econ 101. Is there a natural monopoly? Like, oh, well, once you've run the power lines, maybe it's hard to have competition, so it's kind of a natural monopoly to have an electrical service provider. That's proven not to be true, but that's a blackboard version.
Oxymoron, natural monopoly.
Yeah, or there's externalities. So pollution needs to be regulated because if somebody's spewing particles into the air and it's falling on into your environment, you don't have any control over them. So this is where the government steps in. I'm not aware of any argument that outside of essentially the Communist Manifesto for the government operating schools. So
government schooling is included in the communist planks in the Communist Manifesto. But the so-called economic argument that you'll hear people perpetuate, it's a myth when it comes to the government school system. They'll say the government needs to run schools because it's a quote-unquote public good. It's more like a public bad in places like Baltimore, where they have 40% of their high schools with 0% proficiency rates in math. 0 kids in 40% of their public schools having proficiency in math. It's a total clown show. It's a disaster. It's a dumpster fire. That is not a public good. But the argument they'll say is that the two conditions of a public good is that it has to be non-rivalrous and non-excludable, according to the economics definition.
Right. So this would be like the national
public
parks.
Schools are both of those things. They are excludable, and they also are rivalrous in consumption. So, and evidence for this is that private schools exist. It is not a public good. You don't have a free rider problem. You can limit it to payers. And look, public schools do exclude on the basis of zip code as well. So they aren't just excludable, they do exclude. And even Milton Friedman wrote about this in 1955 in The Role of Government in Education in his essay, where he pointed out that even if there were positive externalities of schooling, which, by the way, schooling is not the same thing as education, you can get a good education outside of those walls. And there's a lot of negative externalities of schooling too, where you might learn that it's cool to be in a gang, it's cool to do drugs. And I had a lot of those influences in my government school experience growing up in San Antonio, Texas, in my middle school. We'd play this game called 10 Seconds. That was the cool thing to do. You fight for 10 seconds. And then that was the end of the game. I mean, we had kids getting rolled into the gang in the bathroom. That was the cool thing. I didn't do it. I didn't fall through the cracks, but kids do fall into the cracks when they're surrounded by that for long periods of time, for several years. And that's not a public good. That's a public bad. They're better off being at home with their parents, not being around these influences. But all that to say, Milton Friedman pointed out that even if we all agreed that there were net positive externalities of schooling, that it was a great thing to do, and that what he means by externalities is that there are benefits to people who don't directly engage in the transaction. So it's beyond what the kid experiences. It's beyond what the school or provider's experiencing, is that these third parties, the rest of society, benefits if everybody's super educated. I would say, one, the kind of individuals that the government school system is churning out is not a benefit for third parties. We saw what happened with the riots in over the past few years, mostly peaceful protests. I think teaching kids to not like each other based on immutable characteristics and dividing kids in the government school system, that is leading to negative externalities, not positive externalities. But even if we agreed that everything was positive, that this was a good environment, Milton Friedman pointed out that that doesn't necessarily imply that government should be running the schools. That would only imply that there might be some benefit of having taxpayers fund a certain portion of schooling at the K through 12 level. And even then, there's no reason why we should structure it where we're funding government schooling for everybody, including Bill Gates's kids.
Right.
I mean, the argument for food stamps is that there's a benefit of having a well-fed populace, and that we don't want people starving. But then do we say, oh, let's give food stamps to Bill Gates? No, we say it should just be for the least advantaged who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford it. And so you could imagine a society, if we started from scratch, where with education, we'd have education stamps. They'd all be private providers. You don't need the government to run the institutions. And you wouldn't need to fund it for the highest of incomes. You'd fund it for a small segment of the population. But these aren't policy proposals I'm arguing for right now. I understand the world that we live in today, and the best solution from a realistic standpoint is to have the funding we're already allocating to K through 12 fund the kid as opposed to the institution, to fund the student, not the system.
If you like this clip, we've got so much more where that came from. So be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you won't miss our new videos as they come out each week.